hello to everyone. My name is Anna Barber, and I'm the curator of exhibitions and public programs here at the museum. I'm very happy to be here with all of you this afternoon, and I'm thrilled to welcome our special guest, Skip Finley, who will be taking us into the world of whaling and the lives of the men of color who rose to the rank of captain. So hello, Skip.
Howdy, how we doing?
So for those of you joining us from the Vineyard, you will likely know and adore Skip just as much as we do here at the museum. He's been a fixture on the island since he first started summering here as a boy. And in fact, we have right behind me in the permanent exhibit behind me, we have the most adorable photograph of little young Skip in one of our exhibitions. If that's not a reason to come visit the museum, I don't know what is. So after an incredibly successful career in radio, from executive to station owner, Skip switched gears and took up writing, including the Oak Bluffs town column for the Vineyard Gazette. But it was an article that he wrote for Martha's Vineyard magazine on Black whaling captains that sent him on a years-long journey to uncover the stories of whaling captains of color, more than a few who are connected to the island, that resulted in his critically important book, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. If you haven't read it, if you don't own it, please do. It's an incredibly important book, and that just came out last year. One of the men who is featured in Skip's book is Captain William Martin of Edgartown. Martin, who went on his first voyage as a teenager 5 years before the start of the Civil War, became a captain just over 20 years later. And as Skip may tell you, the research process can be daunting, especially when trying to uncover the stories of those who have so long been left out of the historical record. And sometimes accidental discoveries can be made that shed just a bit more light on the past. In October of 2019, Bo Van Riper, the museum's steadfast research librarian, uncovered a series of 8 letters written by Captain Martin during his last voyage in 1889. 3 of those letters are currently on exhibit here at the museum, and if you are here and around, I encourage you to please come and see them. To be able to come face to face with the very paper and the very ink that Captain Martin used is an amazing experience, and one that only museums can offer. So I'd like to turn it over to Skip, who will be sharing some of the stories of Martin and others whose contributions to the whaling industry are now, with his help, being told and learned and shared. Please note that we will be taking questions at the end, so feel free to post a question at any time in the chat box, and I will direct them to Skip when he is done talking with us. So hello, Skip, again, and welcome.
Anna, thank you very much. This is wonderful. I'm glad to be here. Actually, nowadays, I'm glad to be anywhere. But here, I'm particularly glad to be here for so many reasons. There's so many coincidences. One, my book here, Whaling Captains of Color, really began with writing. This time, most of my conversation today, though, I'm going to talk very specifically about these 8 letters that Martin wrote to the owner of the whale ship he was on at the time. Astoundingly enough, we still do have the log from that whale trip, which turned out to be Martin's last one. So I'm going to kind of sort of walk you through what was going, a little bit about whaling, what was going on at the time, a little background on these guys, what happened during this roughly 2-week period when Martin was stuck in Norfolk, Virginia, amidst the whale troop. And then, of course, what happens afterwards, and then we'll take some questions. I want to be particularly well organized. I used to be a board member of my favorite museum here, and this is not a time for me to be rambling on. 8 handwritten letters were recently discovered and transcribed by Bowden Van Riper, Martha's Vineyard Museum's research librarian, from William A. Martin, a black whaling captain from Edgartown, to Samuel Osborne Jr., the owner of the Eunice A. Adams, during what turned out to be Martin's last whaling trip. Martin inspired me to write the book, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy, that details how men of color actually became captains. And thanks to Bo, I've recently written an article for an upcoming Martha's Vineyard Museum Quarterly about these 8 letters from Martin. The Charles W. Morgan was built in 1841. 17 of its original crew of 30 and its captain were all from Martha's Vineyard. After a complete renovation and restoration, it sailed on its 38th voyage. This is the first time anyone alive had ever seen a real whale ship under sail. It arrived here in Martha's Vineyard on June 23rd, 2014, and the significance was marked by a feature story in the May-June 2014 issue of Martha's Vineyard magazine, and I was lucky enough to be chosen to write an article about Captain Martin, who I knew nothing about. 2,700 ships took 15,913 trips with a goal of finding the whale, kill it, cut it up, melt it down to oil, fill the hull, and return home. Each of these was a separate business enterprise and what turns out to be the model for today's private equity and hedge funds. Whaling was the second most dangerous occupation after mining. It was so difficult that upwards of 90% of the people only went once, except those with no alternative, including everyone of color in the years after America had been freed, but all of its citizens had not. Only 47 of 2,500 whaling captains were killed by whales, but close to 950 were replaced due to accidents, sickness, or death. Thousands of miles from shore, no one cared who had the skill to get a ship home with its cargo. As a result, over half the men of color rose to masters as replacements, thereby making whaling an unprecedented meritocracy. There were no occupations leading to wealth for men of color in the 18th and 19th centuries. Of approximately 175,000 whaling participants, 30 to 40% were men of color: free black men, former slaves, West Indians, American Indians, Cape Verdeans, Kanakas, Maori, and South Sea Islanders. It's due to systemic racism that I specifically use free black men and former slaves instead of African Americans, because black people were not Americans until after 1863's Emancipation Proclamation. We actually could use the year 1965, when the Voting Rights Act included us as Americans, and whaling was only a memory. It's pertinent to remember that from 1889, when this story takes place, to 1929, when whaling ended, a black person in America was hung or burned to death every 4 days. Whaling achieved its peak production in the 1800s when slavery was a law. Voyages averaged 3 to 4 years on relatively small vessels shared by 20 to 35 other crew members. The difficult occupation created opportunity for men of color like William A. Martin, a black man from Edgartown. He went to sea when he was 16. During his whaling career from 1846 to 1890, he served 14 times on 11 ships, 5 owned by Samuel Osborne Jr., 2 of which he captained of the 3 times he served as a master. Osborne was also born in Edgartown. With an entrepreneurial bent, he opened a clothing store, followed by investments in whaling as an owner of ships individually and in partnership with others. By the 1880s, Osborne was the largest individual whale ship owner in America and amassed a fortune of over $13 million in today's funds. He built today's immaculate Charlotte Inn on South Summer Street for his 2 wives and sons. I know the place well. It's across the street from where I work at the Vineyard Gazette. Coincidentally, Mr. Osborne was a Republican, the party of Lincoln credited with freeing America's slaves. This aspect of his life, coupled with the activities of many Vineyard abolitionists, suggests a possible reason Osborne placed such great faith in William A. Martin, who worked in several of his ships, ending with the Eunice A. Adams. The Adams was built and launched in 1845 by Freeman E. Adams of Nantucket. The single-deck, 2-mast coasting schooner was named for his wife, the former Eunice H. Nickerson. In 1867, the 82-foot, 110-foot vessel was re-rigged as a brig and commenced her new life as a whaler. It was the last whaling vessel registered on Nantucket and took 14 whaling voyages, 4 from Nantucket, 5 from New Bedford, and 5 from Martha's Vineyard, leaving from Edgartown. Becoming a whaler after its first 22 years, the old ship pursued it for another 27. The Adams wound up as the second to the last of all the whale ships to depart from Edgartown before the Hattie E. Smith. The importance of the Vineyard to whaling is indicated by 175 men who captained 98 ships on 247 whaling expeditions beginning in 1738. That doesn't include other ships owned by Vineyarders that left from other ports like New Bedford and Nantucket, and they're not included in those statistics. A leading whale port in the 19th century, between 1835 and 1845 alone, 110 different whaling captains built homes in Edgartown. One was Cornelius M. Marchand, co-owner of the Adams along with Osborne. Marchand, who had captained 4 whale ships himself, was master of the Adams' first voyage that left Edgartown in June 1884. It returned later that month due to a hurricane that cost 3 whale boats and caused the ship to leak badly. After repairs, Marchand wound up dying aboard the ship in Barbados. But the ship's chronic leaking would have severe deleterious impact on its next to last voyage 3 years later. From the mid-1700s to the early 1900s, the key variables of success for whaling were the luck of good weather and the availability of the catch. On October 16, 1887, with William A. Martin as its master, the pilot of the Eunice H. Adams steered the ship from its dock in Edgartown, headed for the North Atlantic, and was to become an unlucky trip marked by bad weather. The initial omens weren't good, the force of the wind causing Martin to anchor up, and as a result, the trip didn't actually begin until 3 days later. Fortunately for historians, Martin's original logbook of this voyage of the Eunice H. Adams is reproduced digitally online. Of over 15,000 whaling expeditions, we only have about 3,000 of these logs left, that are known to remain anyway. Now, the information in most logs was cursory at best. It detailed the location of the ship, weather, size, and location of whales caught, if they caught any at all, and much of the time they didn't. Whaling logs portrayed the mind-numbing boredom of voyages, the longest trip of which was the Nile from New London that lasted nearly 12 years from 1858 to 1870, during which it had 7 different captains. This voyage was the 42-year-old Eunice H. Adams' 13th of its 14 whaling expeditions. It was coincidentally the second time it had to return to port because of inclement weather, and the third time it had been caught in a hurricane from June 1884, August 1885, and what you'll see today on December 6, 1887. In addition to the aging vessel's earlier storm-related damage, the Adams at 110 tons was diminutive in size as compared with many ships of the era, such as the iconic 351-ton Charles W. Morgan and the 500-plus ton behemoths that sailed to the Pacific and the Northwest in pursuit of whales. From a local perspective, the 82-foot Adams compares only modestly with Vineyard Haven's Shenandoah, the popular topsail schooner that's 108 feet and 170 tons. For a practical comparison, the Adams had approximately twice the volume of the average American home, belying the fact that as many as 25 men lived aboard for several years. On this, Martin's last trip, the Adams traveled to Cape Verde, St. Eustatius, Dominica, Montserrat, St. Michael's, Barbados, the southern ports of Beaufort, South and Port Royal, South Carolina, and Norfolk, from where the letters were written. In the logbook, which is for the period of 1887 to 1890, there's an inscription across each of the top 2 facing pages reading, "Remarks of a Whaling Voyage on board the brig E.H. Adams, W.A. Martin, Master." My book, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy, was inspired by Martin and includes a substantial amount of information about the trip that I obtained from the Adams log. The log helps with understanding the events before and after the 2 weeks of August and September 1889, when he wrote the featured letters. Martin's voyage began in difficulty and ended badly. From the log, October 16, 1887. Took our anchor from port of New Bedford at 9 o'clock and shaped our course for sea with a company of 25 all told. At 12 noon, discharged the pilot. Wind blowing strong from southwest. At 3 o'clock, kept off and steered for Tarpaulin Cove. Came at anchor at 6 p.m. in 8 fathoms of water. So ends this day. In not giving a lot of information, that's rather typical of an entry in just about any whaling log, which I'd have to admit is probably the worst reading I've ever read. And by that, I include matchbook covers in the back of cereal boxes, either of which I would read before I'll read another whaling log. But curiosity often gets the best of me, and I find myself coming back. The weather caused the ship to lay over for the next 3 days before leaving on October 19th. The log exercises brevity, detailing only what was important, brief mentions of the date, weather, and location of the ship. Sightings of other ships and sea life are noted, in addition to where and when prey was spotted and caught, because that was sometimes two different things, not just one. The trip was hampered by incessant bad wind and weather, with frequent references, and I quote, "The wind blew so we could not lower the boats. Strong winds, heavy and continuous gales, squally with rain. There were plenty of accidents along the way. Men were falling, sometimes overboard, and sicknesses, some specified as diarrhea and mumps." The bad luck voyage didn't have a single notation about Martin feeling sorry for himself along the way. The storm that began December 1st, 1887, developed into hurricane force by the 6th and badly damaged one of the boats used to chase whales. More importantly, it caused severe leakage that continued for the balance of the trip with notations of up to 400 strokes an hour. Strokes is a reference to a seesaw-like device manned by two men. The number represents how many times it was necessary to pump to keep the ship from filling with seawater and sinking. In the log, there are entries of 4,000 stroke days, which suggests full-time pumping. Almost immediately, the crew was perturbed of the danger-induced busy work. Due to its difficult working conditions, crew desertion became part of whaling's business model. There are estimates that from half to 2/3 of the average whale crew left. The telling statistic discounts the fact that when sailors did, owners had no obligation to pay them at voyage's end. And I say that's big part of the business model because that was money that went to the column of profits and not costs as a result. Desertion was a continuing problem for the Adams, beginning the day after the hurricane, when stopping for repairs at Port Royal, a crewman jumped ship, but was returned by a passing boat. The majority of the crew sent a letter to the authorities on shore stating that they considered the vessel unseaworthy and they didn't want to go to sea in the vessel again. One deserter returned with a lawyer who interviewed the crew. On January 3rd, 1888, the ship did raise anchor and head for sea, and the crew agreed to return to work as evidently nothing came from the lawyer's intervention. Still, the Adams had departed with a full crew of 25, as Martin said in the log. By the end of its voyage, 47 men had served aboard. 8 were recorded as having deserted, and there are another 15 that probably did as well. We just don't know specifically that they deserted. They could have been fired was the other alternative. It's unlikely the captain's race had anything to do with the crew desertions. It's more than likely the conditions caused by Mother Nature had caused the rancor. Several crew members were Black, and other men of color were hired as replacements on stops in the West Indies and Cape Verde. Whaling captains did not have the benefit of management training, and many are the stories of poor and dangerous leadership. There's no evidence that this was Martin's problem. He was diligent in reporting the food he broke out to feed the crew, and there are no indications of crewmen being severely punished. The captain provided for occasional leave for the entire crew, and while there were several times they refused to work in each instance, Martin was able to re-engage them, so his managerial skills were at least adequate. The constant references, though, to the ship leaking, harpoons breaking, major and minor accidents, miserable weather, and few whales spotted didn't contribute to the happiness of the crew. Indeed, from launch, it took until November 21st, over a year after they had embarked, before the crew of the Adams even sighted a sperm whale, and until May 1888 to catch one. In June, the ship sent its first cargo of oil home. The following February, May, June, and July were particularly productive in capturing whales, accounting for 10 of what appears to be 17 captured on the trip that ultimately returned with 375 barrels of oil. Worsening weather caused Captain Marker to anchor at Norfolk on August 1st in a rainstorm. With the storm continuing through August 13th, Martin had 123 barrels of oil made ready for transfer for shipping home and drafted the first of these newly discovered letters. In the 2-page first letter of August 13th, 1889, Martin details damage to the ship and repair costs caused by the weather that necessitated the unusual stop at a southern port of Norfolk. As a Black man, just 24 years earlier, thanks to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Martin could have been legally taken into slavery. The ship remained in Norfolk until September 23rd through daily bad weather. In 2 letters sent on August 16th, Martin informs Osborne that he's sending bills for sail repairs and spares and planning to ship the oil home. He also tells that the second mate, Fred West, has left, claiming he'd returned, but Martin doubted it. He's had trouble with him in the past, and he didn't need him to catch whales. The second letter repeats that information about the status of the sails and West leaving. Anxious to depart Norfolk, Martin believes time is wasting. Correspondingly, the log details that on August 15th, crewman John A. Chapman deserted, and on the 16th, Fred West did indeed leave. In the 4th letter, Martin seems to be asking Osborne if he should move south towards Hatteras and Charleston until December, and then other great whaling grounds until April. And there I wanted to stop. They said whaling grounds. There's hundreds of whaling grounds around the world that these men, pursued. But I don't know why they decided to call them whaling grounds, because they're all in the water. Another observation I make is, people refer to the Captain W. Morgan as she. Why would a whale ship be a she any more than a he? And in this case, Captain Morgan was a man. And then finally, the expression that Herman Melville made famous in Moby Dick, "There she blows," is extraordinarily unlikely, as most whaling books will tell you. The expression was probably, blows was the expression, or she blows. And it's unlikely why you call a whale a she versus a he, particularly when the most prized whale, the sperm whale, was a bull and a male. Anyway, back to our story. Captain Martin wrote that the copper had been coming off of the hull as a result of the leaks. By the way, hulls were covered with copper so that microorganisms and seaweed wouldn't grow on top of the wood and slow the boat down along the way. So it was very useful. And it had other uses as well. He acknowledged Osborne had suggested staying in a more northerly route to avoid additional hurricanes, and writes, "I think it would be a very good plan, as I think I can get out of the range of them." The letter suggests Martin had received information from other captains and had likely received word from Osborne regarding the ship's future activity. Apparently receiving a letter from Osborne on the 16th, Martin's next letter on August 18th seems to be responding to questions about what had happened to the earlier deserters who were mistakenly looking to be paid, according to Martin. First Mate Gibbons is now the only man left of the original crew of all the men who shipped. In other words, almost 100% of the crew now was new. Martin was evidently having problems with the local custom house. Bills had not been paid, and the oil was being held almost for ransom. And Osborne had suggested they slip out at night. With the authorities withholding his papers, this wasn't a good possibility. Perhaps as a sign of good faith, Martin ordered and paid for provisions that hadn't yet been put on board. The comments and the tone of Martin's letter indicates he wasn't enamored at all with his experience in Norfolk. And the August 19th letter, number 6, Martin accounts for $700 spent on the ship, noting that he had spent as little as necessary, and that additional funds might be required. Putting this in perspective, $700 then is equivalent of $20,000 today. Martin mentions a Mr. Peed, who's otherwise undescribed, who Osborne had sent money to, and while his relationship is unclear, the letter suggests Peed may have become an impediment in the ship's leaving Norfolk, perhaps as a result of the unpaid bills. Martin was clearly unhappy with the situation. He mentioned that he believes the new crewmen wouldn't desert, as they were all well treated. Later, he turns out to be mistaken. This letter finally suggests discord of some unknown import. Had Peed rendered some service or provided supplies for which compensation had not arrived? It seems some type of legal threat was implied, perhaps preventing the ship from leaving, as I'd stated, but this is not clear. What is enlightening is the first negative comments from Martin, talking about the whole situation, characterizing it as a mean thing to do. He thinks he's being taken advantage of out here, and it's a mean act. This appears in his log and his letters, so clearly the man had backbone. Log entries during the stay in Norfolk are even briefer than those under sail. On Friday, August 25th, it's highlighted by the ominous comment, "Last entry to be made by Arthur O. Gibbons." Captain Martin had kept the crew busy with maintenance, repair, and painting aboard the old ship. After August 25th, the log is now written by someone other than Gibbons, the first mate who had been keeping it, and possibly by Martin, as the handwriting compares favorably with the letters he'd written to Osborne. Letter 7 on September 6th tells us Martin had received a telegram from Osborne suggesting that Martin have the second mate assist with the ship's outfitting. In the short note, he informs Osborne that he's preparing to leave and resume the trip. Reiterating his less than complete happiness with the situation in Norfolk, it's instructive that the relationship between Samuel Osborne, a white owner, and Martin, a man of color, is marked by candor and seeming mutual respect in those unambiguous racial times. In the last letter, number 8, Martin's letter in this series to Osborne is pretty clear. Had the weather been better, he would not have wound up in Norfolk. The letter's unexpected directness may have had something to do with his relationship with Osborne. Paraphrased for ease of reading, Martin wrote, Mr. Osborne, dear sir, I pen you a few lines to inform you that 5 men ran away last night, and I should have been to sea by this time. As the weather's getting better, and there's nothing to stop me from going. I've sent you a telegram to send 6 men in a boat stearer. I'll take them out of the steamer so they cannot get on shore and go to sea the same day. It was common practice in whaling not to let men get too close to shore, factoring the prospect of desertion. In fact, when they anchored offshore, they tried to be far enough away so it wasn't an easy swim. Martin concludes in his letter, if it had not been such bad weather, I should have been to sea long ago, but it's been a heavy gale here. But it is over, and I want to get on Hatteras ground at once, which will take 2 days. I hope to get a good season, and I believe I will if I have weather to do so. I wrote you yesterday that I did not want to come here again. It is a bad place in the winter. He ends asking Osborne to hurry and send the men. On September 22nd, after a month-long unproductive stay, the Eunice H. Adams departed Norfolk. According to the ship's log, on September 28th, it was Captain Martin who sighted the first sperm whale the ship had caught since June 30th. The voyage continued with modest success and awful weather, and the leaking continued through January 6, 1890, when Martin's part of the log ends mysteriously, and the entry reads, Monday, January 6, commences with a calm, 1 ship in sight. After blank page, a new one begins with a new mass and entry that said, Remarks of a whaling voyage on board brig E.H. Adams, T.E. Fordham, master. And then he writes, Remarks on board Thursday, February 20, arrived on board about noon and find all hands dissatisfied with everything. Brig leaking bad and provisions bad and long lays. So ends this day. The long lays reference is basically an expression that they're not being well paid and particularly not catching a lot of whales that pays even worse. Meanwhile, there's no indication of what happened to Martin or the ship between February 6th and February 20th. Typically, when masters were replaced, it was due to illness, but there's no discussion of the circumstances that caused Thomas E. Fordham to replace Martin and bring the ship home. Even more mysteriously, First Mate Arthur O. Gibbons left the ship. Fordham writes in the log, Remarks on board February 21st. This day, the mate took what belonged to him and went ashore without saying one word to me. I told him he had better see Mr. Billingham's, but he did not. No idea who Mr. Billingham is. I'm reluctant to speculate in this turn of events. Perhaps Gibbons, loyal to William A. Martin, was less so with Captain Fordham. In any event, according to the log, Fordham returned the ship to New Bedford on Monday, March 9th, 1890, despite several archival sources indicating the term to have been in September 1890. Coincidentally, Martin's first mate, Arthur O. Gibbons, was a master himself. 11 whale trips after that, from 1892 to 1950, that coincidentally included the Charles W. Morgan in 1908. The Eunice H. Adams' final whaling trip occurred 3 years after Captain Fordham returned, from August 1893 to September 1894, under the command of Clarence J. Sylvia, and his replacement, John T. Gonzalez, another captain of color who, in another delightful coincidence, was the last captain of the Charles W. Morgan, that became the last American whale ship and that precipitated my story on Captain Martin. 2 years later, the Adams ended its career when it was scrapped at New Bedford in 1896. 4 years older than William A. Martin, Samuel Osborne Jr. had pursued whaling since before his acquisition of the Clarice in 1872. It's likely the two may have become acquainted in 1853 when Martin served on the Europa, if not before, thereby enjoying a relationship that lasted for 42 years until Osborne's death. The business relationship between the two may have led to or resulted from a long friendship between this white man and this black man, almost certainly begun before the Civil War. A story published in the Vineyard Gazette 2 months before his death at age 77 saluted William Martin and Sarah Brown's 50th wedding anniversary and included a passage. Captain Martin has been a paralytic for the last 7 years and is now practically helpless. To those who remember Captain Martin as he appeared some 25 years ago and recall his quick, alert movements and crisp, decisive speech, qualities which went far to make him a successful whaleman, it's difficult to realize his utter helplessness at the present time, and he has the deep sympathy of all in the community. Thus far, I've been unable to find information on what Captain William A. Martin did during the 20 years from his last whale trip until his death. His and Sarah's house in Chappaquiddick remains, but it's in disrepair. Martin's letters provide a rare inside view of whaling and helps tell a one-of-a-kind historical story of men, their ship, and prey. Thanks to Bo for discovering them, and to the Martha's Vineyard Museum for its mission to inspire people to discover, explore, and strengthen connections to the island and its diverse heritage. Thanks to your financial contributions, the museum was able to build our new space that allows for the identification, study, and storage of the island's historical artifacts. And thank you for joining us. And now I'll entertain some questions. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Skip. We do have a couple of questions that came through.
Shocked by that news.
So the first question from way back in the beginning is from Nina. She says, hello from New York City. Did any captains own their ships?
Several did, particularly later. Incredibly enough, the first captain, Paul Cuffey, was the first to own ships. In fact, he's noted for becoming a whaling captain in 1758, which is the same year the state of Massachusetts made a law that every man could vote unless you were Native American, Black, or Musty. But he owned his first ships, and several of them did later on.
We have another question from...
And there's a list of them in the book.
Yes, that's right. Phil Hart. Hello, Phil.
Hey, Phil.
He says, the story of the discovery of the 8 letters by William A. Martin is a good example of the constant evolution of history. Do you know if other letters penned by William Martin may still be intact either on the Vineyard or elsewhere?
I can assure you that our librarian, Bo Van Riper, and his entire staff of volunteers are now, who have the space to go through our archives, are looking for more. As far as we know, these may be the only letters that exist from a Black whaling captain. In fact, we're not too sure these aren't the only letters from another whaling captain. Of course, we do have a museum over in New Bedford, the Whaling Museum there, and the one in Nantucket, and they may have some in their archives. But these are the first I've become aware of.
Yes, discoveries are being made every day, which is...
Except for being difficult to read. It was just outstanding.
So we have a question from Edward Lewis, who asks, why would you go to sea without an obligation to get paid?
That's a good question, but if you consider the times, and even setting aside for a moment the Black captains, let's just talk about, the general, 18-year-old, good-looking, tall, rail-thin, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white kid who's standing in front of the old lighthouse in Edgartown with his girlfriend the night before his first trip, and all they can think about is their brand new life when he comes back and they're going to get married and he's going to come home rich. He probably got to the second buoy and started throwing up and didn't stop for a week. People weren't told how bad whaling was. I have yet to find anything positive about whaling, except of course the money or the motive, as they say. For the slaughter of, I believe, 300,000 whales for about $10 billion over a 280-year period.
Okay, so we have a question from Kelly. She says, hi, Skip. Has it always been known that there was at least one black whaling captain, and how many in the U.S. could there have been? Oh, there's a could there.
That's a good one. First, no. When I started writing this article, doing information on Captain Martin, I had no clue there was such a thing as a black whaling captain at all. I have found 52, perhaps 53, in one of these Zooms I did the other night for, I think, University of Connecticut. One of the persons there gave me a name, and it turns out he was a black captain as well, so we'll be adding to the list. That doesn't, repeat that question again. There's another point I wanted to make.
Yes, so how many in the U.S. could there have been?
All right. It's a fact that we'll never know. Many people on whale ships, 30 to 40% of everyone who ever went whaling were people of color, men of color. Many of them probably were runaway slaves. To the extent that is true, I'm certain they would have changed their name or their identity somewhat, and we'll never know. We'll just never know. But we do know there have been 106 black men to play quarterback in the NFL. So we have half of those were whaling captains, and there's not going to be any more whaling.
This isn't a question, but we just have a comment from Penny Gamble Williams. Hello, Penny, who just wanted to thank you. And she is the great grandniece of Sarah Brown.
Sarah Brown.
Penny, it's nice to have you here.
Penny's in my book. And Penny used to, I think, live on Tuckernuck here in Oak Bluffs. If I'm not mistaken.
So that sort of goes hand in hand with a question from Andrea, who asked, did Martin have children, and did they follow him into the trade?
Two answers. One you didn't ask. No, we're fairly certain Martin and Sarah never had children. If you think about it, they were married for 50 years, and for 46 of those, he was at sea. Well, since he was 16, I mean, there's a gap, there's a differential. I'm sorry, repeat that again.
It was just asking about did he have any children, and did they follow him into the trade? No,
and I think Paul Cuffey's family was involved in the business. Several of the Cape Verdeans' sons came into the business. As though that, whaling was not an acquired skill. Whaling required courage more so than skill of anything else. But it wasn't a transferable skill. Unless you owned a whale ship, you had nothing to pass down. The business was so bad, the kids just didn't want to do it. But it's very rare for there to be more than 2 generations of people. Dad, son, that was pretty much it.
So we have another question here. It says, by some estimates, 30% of the thousands of whalers active before the Civil War were minorities. That's a remarkable thing to think about, given especially the conditions, the length of time, and the relative intimacy required of a whaling voyage. I understand the necessity of one's skill set being more important than the color of their skin for work such as this, but is there something else going on, something different about the whaling industry that allowed for this to happen?
Dramatically so. Remember, we are on ship that's the size of 2 average American homes with 35 or 36 other people for 3 to 4 years. You couldn't fight, you couldn't argue, you did what the captain said. The captain was omniscient. Whatever he told you to do, you had no option but to do. One of those things, he wants you to help him catch whales, not fight amongst yourselves. Now, if you compare that with the military, they're going from here to there to kill people, and then they're going to come back. So it's not necessarily going to be a 3 to 4 year voyage, or like the Nile, to almost 12 years. The same as in the merchant marine. Racism was and still is rampant. You couldn't be a racist on a whale ship, unless of course you kept it to yourself. In the book, I do cite several examples of the use of the N-word. All resulted in death. I've got a representative picture see if I can show it to you. It's hard to imagine a picture like this that a crewman painted. There's a drawing, a set of 6 of these. Okay, that's called set 2 between the steward and the cook. In 1854, you didn't see a whole lot of black guys kicking a whole bunch of white guys' butt anywhere. If you were on land, you could be hung, you could be burned, you'd be killed. Not on a whale ship. And the other answer is the 30 to 40%. That's my number. That's not a published number anywhere. A lot of folks, particularly the museum, know I'm ADHD and I'm OCD. I read really fast. There are a collection of 135 card catalog drawers with thousands of names and information on, index-sized cards. I went to the New Bedford Free Public Library and I read them all. I scanned several, had them make copies for me of things. And everyone that identified a person as Black, those are copies I collected, and that I kept. The New Bedford Whaling Museum and the Mystic Seaport have gotten together and they put together a website called whalinghistory.org. If you need some information, that's the first place to go. And you can look up literally by ship or by person's name and see, was your great-great-grandfather a whaling captain? Probably not, but could have been. This is a business no one wanted to do.
So we have a question from Timothy who's asking, when crew members jump ship in foreign ports, how did they return to their home or elsewhere in the United States?
The ones that chose to go home, would hitch a ride on the next whale ship. And probably the one headed back to New Bedford or wherever they had left from is the smart ass answer.
We have a question from Kenneth who's asking, did any Cape Verdean whalers become captains?
Almost half of my 52 captains are Cape Verdean, as described, and they're all listed in the book. By the way, over there in the books, if you can see on those shelves there, the 3 shelves on the bottom and the next 2 things, those are the whaling books I went out to my wife's surprise and bought without mentioning to her. But I guess I own now about 140 whaling books. I spent close to $4,000 on it. That was some shocking information, but again, I'm ADHD, so it keeps me out of trouble. And as a result, Karen pays all the bills and I have an expense account and an ATM card. And a great relationship with Amazon.
Well, that sort of leads into another question here from Laura, who says, I can't wait to read this book. What do you think will be your next one?
Great question. First, having been a broadcaster and then deciding one day to be a writer, and now having written 3 books, one you don't know about because a lady friend of mine from here in the Vineyard and I, Vanity produced a book called a Martha's Vineyard Love Story, which is pretty good. We may finally, redo that in a larger volume. But right now, I've been approached by several folks looking to do some kind of options on my book. So my next goal is to get something I can lay back and look at, a documentary, a Netflix, probably not a big screen because that's kind of one and done. But a book's unlikely.
Yeah, I think that I could see a series on these on Netflix.
Well, I started this project, and I think it was February 2014. I submitted my manuscript in December 2017. The book was published on June 15th this past year in 2020. So that was about 6 years. I'm 72 now. I'm not betting I got another 6 years, and I don't want to push my luck.
Well, we've all benefited greatly from the 6 years in that work. You've accomplished a lifetime in 6 years. We have a couple more questions that came through. We have one from Doug Levins. Hey, Doug. How often did whalers of color make enough money to start a new life and rise to middle class with some education? Well, as much as I hate to say it, that social construct of a middle class really didn't exist in these days.
All of these captains, these 50 guys, by the way, they killed about 1,800 whales. They brought back about 235,000, barrels of oil, worth about $75 million. If they were captains, 1/10, 1/15, 1/14 will probably be, I don't know, say it's $7.5 million, $8 million divided by 50 people. That's a lot of money even today. Back then it was well more than a fortune. But if you were Black or a person of color, what could you do with it? You couldn't buy a home. Okay, you might perhaps can build one. We're only aware, I believe, of about 4 whaling captains of color whose homes still exist. Only one is a national landmark, William Shorey's out in Oakland. But you can have lots of cash, but you had nothing to invest it in. You couldn't make more money with your money as everyone else could. You couldn't buy a farm. You couldn't buy a store. If you opened a store, no one would shop there. That was part of the American dream for everybody except us. Little of this money lasted more than 2 generations.
So we have a question from Andrea who's asking, thanks to the MV Museum, we are aware that at least one captain from Martha's Vineyard chose to take his family, wife, daughter, and son whaling. Do we know if any captains of color took their wives or daughters?
Yes, we do. William T. Shorey did. Valentines Rosa did. You guys might have a picture there of at least one of those guys. I don't know if I sent you one of those or not. Yes, several of them did. In fact, Valentines Rosa, a very interesting guy. He's one of my favorites. He was on a whale ship, did a great job. There you go. That's Valentines Rosa and his wife. He actually took her on a whale trip, at which time he hit a reef and sank the boat, but he returned home with her and the rest of the family and the crew all safely, shall I say. But he was taught to navigate by the captain's wife, who was a navigator on board a ship he was on. And here on Martha's Vineyard, there have been others. Manuel Ears was a captain of color. He didn't live here, but he sailed a ship out of here. He was on board with his wife and children as well. And there are a few others. DeLomba, I think, was one. The few that we're aware of are mentioned in the book. And speaking of the devil, that was DeLomba and that's Shorey. And there he's got his, he was a Cape Verdean. Look at his gorgeous little girls all dressed up, hopefully in their Sunday white, aboard Daddy's whale ship. He was one of the ones who did ownership.
So Skip, have you found any evidence of Vineyard or Vineyard-connected whale ships being involved in the slave trade?
No. In fact, I'm rereading the story of the Wida. They've got some new news, just came out, in the public recently. For those who aren't aware, the Wida was originally built as a slave ship in England. It was captured by pirates with 100 slaves aboard. Most of them were released, or sold. The ship became a pirate ship again, and as many as 50 people of their 150-person crew were men of color. Now, yes, we had Black pirates too. We're good at everything.
I think that's your next book.
Oh, that's been done. My good friend Eric J. Dolan did the book on pilots. Black Flags, if anyone has an interest. If you're interested in more books about ladies on whale ships, please get Lisa Neuling's Captain Ahab Had a Wife.
Can you recommend beyond that for people who want to know more about people of color who are involved in the whaling industry? Where would you direct them?
Right now, you're forced to go to my book. That's it. And for it, I didn't half-step. All those books, 200 monographs and master's theses, thousands of websites. I literally went out to find every story I possibly could about, whaling captains of color, and proceeded to summarize it, in the book. But that's it. Listen, when I saw Hidden Figures, I came home astounded. Wow, this is great. I can't believe it. John Glenn said, if that black lady doesn't do the math, I'm not getting on the spaceship. Well, then all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, this wasn't, the pharaohs. This happened while I was alive. I probably watched it on TV. Why do we not know this? I don't expect people to know stories about black whaling captains because that's not an expectation one would have, particularly in the years of slavery.
Yeah, Martin's story, though, is given when he was coming of age, getting involved, and being born and raised here on the island. And
people have no idea. I mean, Martin's story is just so incredible. His great grandfather was the first person killed during the Revolutionary War here on Martha's Vineyard. Okay, his great grandmother was a slave who was freed, and in Chilmark. So when you go to Great Rock Bike, that's the Rebecca. That's his grandmother, his great grandmother, and he was raised by his grandmother, who, for all intent and purposes, Black Nance was a witch. So every part of his story is insanely. How can this be? How can this have happened? Stories like that probably don't happen in too many other places than Martha's Vineyard or in Nantucket, where slavery really ended first.
How, I don't see any more questions popping up now, but just to sort of wrap it up, I mean, how would you say the role of the Quakers had, and how strongly that philosophy had in making and allowing whaling to be a place where all people could rise up? How much of a role did that play?
Fundamentally, all of it. The Quakers, the Friends, as we call them, who were oppressed even by the Pilgrims after they left England, they decided that, that men should not be enslaved. All right, and to the extent and their story in whaling, is fundamentally unbelievable. The Quakers actually began the industry of whaling on Nantucket. Also on Nantucket, there was once a man with a slave who was hired out to go to work on a whale ship, and the owner would be paid the man's wages. In fact, he did such a good job, the captain said, "No, hell no, I'm paying you," and paid him. And there was a lawsuit, and at the end of the lawsuit, the net result was in 1775, there were no more slaves on Nantucket, because in 1773, right after this case, they outlawed slavery. We don't get taught that in school. So Nantucket played a huge role. The Quakers played a huge role because they were the ones. When the slave catchers went to Nantucket, they were thwarted at every opportunity. Probably when Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery using the seamen's certificates that all these sailors had to use, kind of like as their passport. When he escaped slavery and went to New Bedford to work as a caulker, he probably worked on whale ships, owned by Quakers. And the biggest one was William Roach. The Roach family was just amazing. The Roaches and Paul Cuffey were very good friends. Paul Cuffey, managed to equate his business and his family after the Roach family. So there are a lot of places where this story diverges, and it was by them.
Well, I think that if you all out there have not read this book yet, please get a copy of it. I
know y'all can buy 6. Amazon, they're giving them away. Buy 6 or 7, give them to friends. No test. Don't even read the book. Buy 6. It's Black History Month. Support the brother.
There you go. That's right. And the work that Skip has been doing to learn more about Martin's life in the light of the discovery of the letters is going to be coming up in the next issue of the quarterly. So please check that out. If you're not a member of the museum, please join and you'll get access to that. But we are so appreciative of you joining us tonight, Skip, and look forward to your continued research and what you're able to uncover about this really important story. And we look forward to learning more. So thank you.
And Anna, you can buy the book at the museum, and the few that are left there are signed and they're first editions, first printings.
That's right.
That's how it comes. If you buy the book and want a signed autograph, go to my website, skipfinley.com, send me a note and your address, and I'll send you a what's called a book plate with, that'll be signed.
Yes, so make a trip out of it. Come see Martin's letters in person in our gallery, and then buy a copy of Skip's book. It sounds like a wonderful way to spend the weekend. So we hope to see you here. Thank you so much, Skip. Stay well. We'll see you soon. And take care, everyone.
Sign up. Bye. Thanks, everyone.